Hi, I'm Christine from the Quilters Retreat. We're going to make this sweet little baby quilt from start to finish. This is the Little Keepsake Baby Quilt. It finishes about 36 inches by 36 inches. It's a nice, manageable size for a first quilt, a baby gift, a stroller quilt, or a small nursery quilt.
If you already know how to use your sewing machine, but quilting still feels a little mysterious, this series is for you. We're not going to spend a lot of time on basic sewing machine skills, but we are going to slow down and focus on the things that are different about quilting. Accurate cutting, a consistent scant 1/4 inch seam, careful pressing, layering the quilt, quilting it on a home machine, and finishing it with binding. Now for this quilt, we're going to start with the center panel, then add side strips, the inner border, a simple pieced block border, and outer borders. And after the quilt top is finished, we'll make what quilters call a quilt sandwich. Quilt it with simple straight line quilting, trim it up, and add the binding around the edges.
Now remember, the goal here is not perfection. The goal is to help you make your first quilt with confidence. Quilts are handmade, and especially when you're learning, every small little wobble or slight imperfection is just part of the story.
By the end of this series, you'll understand the basics of making a quilt. Not just this quilt, but many simple quilts that you may want to make in the future.
So let's start with what makes quilting a little different from other kinds of sewing. Before we start cutting and sewing, I want to talk for a minute about what makes quilting different from other kinds of sewing. Now, if you already sew, you already have a wonderful head start. You know how your machine works, you understand fabric, and you're probably completely comfortable sewing a straight seam. Quilting uses those same skills, but asks us to pay attention in a slightly different way.
The biggest difference is that quilting is built from a lot of small measurements that all add up. One of the most important quilting habits is sewing with a consistent 1/4 inch seam, and often what quilters call a scant 1/4 inch seam, which we'll talk about more in a later section. That seam allowance is what helps your blocks and borders come out the size the pattern expects. That's why quilters talk so much about accurate cutting and consistent seam allowance. It's because accuracy makes the pieces fit together more easily, and that makes the whole process less frustrating. Another quilting habit that may feel different is pressing. In regular sewing, we often say iron, and we may move the iron back and forth across the fabric. In quilting, you usually hear people say press. Now, pressing means we set the iron down, we lift it up, and we set it down again. We try not to push and slide the fabric around because quilt pieces, especially long strips or small blocks, can stretch or distort. Pressing helps the quilt top stay flatter and more accurate.
It may help to think of quilting in 3 big stages.
First, we make the quilt top. That's the pretty pieced layer you see on the front of the quilt. Second, we layer the quilt top with batting and backing, and we quilt through all 3 layers. That stitching is what turns the fabric top into an actual quilt. And finally, we bind the edges, which covers the raw edges and gives the quilt a finished frame.
So as we go through this, remember, quilting isn't about suddenly becoming perfect. It's about learning a few new habits that help your pieces behave. Cut carefully, sew consistently, press gently, and give yourself permission to learn as you go.
Before we jump into the tools, I want to take a moment to introduce the Quilters Retreat, especially if you're new here. The Quilters Retreat is our little corner of the quilting world, where we create fun, quilty items like t-shirts and mugs, and also beautiful quilt panels, beginner-friendly quilt kits, patterns, and gifts for people who love fabric, color, and handmade things. A lot of what we make is designed to help quilters start with something inspiring, like a sweet fabric panel, and turn it into a finished quilt without feeling overwhelmed. We have a wide variety of baby quilt panels and kits, with new ones coming in every couple weeks. We offer thoughtful gifts, delivered beautifully packaged in a lovely gift box with a custom quilt-inspired card. We also have a corner of our store dedicated to quilting music, helpful tools, and cheerful inspiration. So come see us at thequiltersretreat.com and be part of our quilty world.
Now let's look at a few quilting tools you may not have used before. especially the rotary cutter, the cutting mat, and the quilting ruler.
The first one is a rotary cutter. A rotary cutter is basically a very sharp round blade with a handle, and quilters use it to cut fabric quickly and accurately. Scissors still have their place, but for quilting we often need long, straight, repeatable cuts, and a rotary cutter lets us cut strips, squares, and borders much more cleanly. The rotary cutter works together with a self-healing cutting mat. This mat protects your table and gives the blade a safe surface to cut against. You'll notice that the mat has a grid on it, and that grid can be helpful for lining things up. But one thing to keep in mind is that we usually measure with a ruler, not just the mat. Now this is an acrylic quilting ruler. It has measured lines print right on it, and it gives the rotary cutter a straight edge to follow. For this quilt we're going to be cutting strips and small squares, so these markings are going to be our friends. The ruler helps us cut pieces that are the same size over and over again, which is one of the secrets to making a quilt come together without a wrestling match. You'll also want pins or clips. Pins are useful for holding fabric pieces together while you sew, especially when you match seams or really want the edges to match. Clips are handy for thicker areas, binding, or anytime you don't want to poke holes or distort the fabric. For this quilt, use what you're comfortable with. Some quilters love pins, some love clips, some use both. Now later in the series, when we quilt the layers together, a walking foot can be very helpful. A walking foot helps feed the top and bottom layers more easily through the machine. If you have one, wonderful. If you don't, you can still make this quilt. You just want to go more slowly, baste carefully, and guide the quilt gently. Now some sewing machine manufacturers also sell a 1/4 inch foot. That makes it a little easier for you to measure your scant 1/4 inch seam. If you have it, great, bring it along. If not, I'll show you other ways to do it.
Now, quilting gloves are another optional tool. They have grippy fingertips that help you move the quilt under the machine without tugging. They're nice to have, but not required. You can see my quilting gloves are actually gardening gloves. As long as those fingertips are grippy, they will be very helpful.
Now we're going to talk about rotary cutting. Now this is one of the first quilting skills that may feel new if you've sewn before but haven't made quilts. Now the goal is to cut accurate pieces without stretching the fabric and without making the process scary. Rotary cutters are wonderful tools, but they are sharp, so we're going to build safe habits from the beginning. First safety rule, treat the rotary cutter like a kitchen knife with wheels. When you're cutting, pay attention. When you're not cutting, close the blade. I know it sounds simple, but it's one of the most important habits. Cut, close the blade, cut, close the blade, every time. Now when we cut fabric, we often start by folding the fabric neatly. If you're cutting with the fabric strips, that usually means folding the fabric with the salvage edges together and smoothing it flat. Now the salvage edge is the tightly woven edge of the fabric. You don't need to become a fabric scientist here, but knowing where the salvage is can help you understand how the fabric is folded and how those width of fabric strips are cut. Now try not to pull or stretch the fabric, just smooth it out. If the fold is wavy or the edges are not lining up nicely, take a moment to refold. A tidy fold makes accurate cutting much easier. Now there are several ways to do this, but I'm going to start by showing you the simplest, which I often use, especially on beginner projects, and then I'll show you one of the most accurate ways for when you're working with smaller pieces and accuracy becomes super important. The simplest way is to line up the fold of my fabric with one of the horizontal lines on the mat. Place it so that the left side is just slightly before one of the inch markers on the mat. Then place the ruler on the inch marking, being careful to line the ruler up on the top and the bottom of the mat. Now I'm ready to make my cut. If you're doing this with a lot of little pieces and every bit of accuracy matters, then you can use a second ruler in a similar fashion. Line up the fold of your fabric with one of the horizontal lines on the ruler, just a little bit away from the edge. Butt your original ruler against it, then remove the second ruler. Now you're ready to make your cut. You don't want to cut off a lot, so make sure you're placing your ruler so you trim off just enough to make a clean edge. Now let's talk about placement. Keep your fingers on top of the ruler and away from the cutting edge. I like to spread my hand out to hold the ruler steady. If you need to move your hand, stop cutting first, reposition your hand, and then continue. Never let your fingertips hang over the edge of the ruler. The rotary cutter follows that edge, so we want the blade cutting fabric, not giving us a surprise manicure. Now when you make the cut, hold the cutter straight up and down against the ruler. Use steady pressure and make one smooth cut away from your body when possible. Then close the blade. Now we have a clean edge to measure from. For quilting, we measure the width of the strip with the ruler. So if I need a 3.5 inch strip, I line the 3.5 inch mark on the ruler with the clean edge of the fabric. Now this is helpful because sometimes beginners get tempted to only use the lines on the mat. The mat is helpful, but the ruler is usually more accurate because it moves with the cutting edge. So I think of the mat as a support system and the ruler as the measuring tool. Now once the ruler is lined up, hold it steady, fingers back, rotary cutter against the ruler, and cut in one smooth motion. And close the blade again. I'm going to say that a lot because I'd like to see all of us end with the same number of fingers we started with. And now you have a nice straight strip. Now if you get a little spot where the blade didn't cut all the way through, don't yank the fabric apart. That can stretch or distort the piece. Just place the ruler back down and carefully recut that section. Now if you find you start doing more quilting, you may want to consider purchasing a strip ruler just for that purpose. Strip rulers like these make squaring your fabric and cutting strips super easy. Now this ruler isn't as long as my long ruler, so I'll fold my fabric in half again and then place the horizontal line on the ruler with the fold of my fabric. Now to square up my fabric, I'm just going to place my rotary cutter in the 0 strip and cut. And now I'm ready to cut my strips. Cutting a 3.5 inch strip just means finding the 3.5 inch slot, placing my rotary cutter in, and cutting. And once you use one of these, you'll find strip cutting a bit easier. But until you're ready to invest, what I just showed you earlier is a great way to do your strips.
Now before we cut the fabric for this quilt, let's take a minute to read the pattern together. If you're new to quilting, quilt patterns can look a little intimidating at first, but most of them are just giving you a map.
Now let's clear up a few quilting words before we go farther. A strip is a long, narrow piece of fabric. A block is usually a unit of patchwork. In this quilt, our blocks are simple squares. A border is a fabric around the outside of an area. Sashing is the fabric that separates or frames sections. Backing is the fabric on the back of the quilt, and batting is the soft middle layer. Binding is the folding fabric that wraps around the outside at the very end. So when you look at the pattern, don't think of it as one big complicated quilt. Think of it as a set of small jobs. Prepare the panel, cut the strips, cut the squares, sew the center, add the block rows, add the borders, and finish the quilt. Now this diagram shows you where each fabric goes in the finished quilt. Once you understand that, the cutting instructions start to make a lot more sense. Now fabric A is the center panel. It's the focal point of the quilt, the part that gives the quilt its main picture or theme. In this pattern, the panel does a lot of the design work for us, which is one reason why this is such a friendly first quilt. Fabric B is used for main borders and the binding. So this fabric appears around the center area, around the outside edge, and then later it becomes the folded strip that finishes the raw edges of the quilt. Now fabric C is used for the side sashing next to the panel. Sashing is just a strip of fabric that separates or frames part of the quilt. In this pattern, these side strips help the center panel fit nicely in the overall layout. Fabric C also represents one of our set of blocks that's used within the pieced block border. Now fabrics D, E, and F are used for the small colorful blocks around the quilt. These are the pieces that give the quilt that sweet patchwork feeling without making the project feel too complicated. Now for these fabrics, we'll cut strips first, then subcut those strips into squares. That's a very common quilting method, and it's much easier than trying to cut every single square separately from a larger piece of fabric. Now you may see the abbreviation WOF, which means width of fabric. For regular quilting cotton, that usually means cutting from salvage to salvage across the fabric. The exact usable width can vary a little depending upon the fabric, but when a quilting diagram says cut a strip width of fabric, it usually means you're cutting a long strip across the folded fabric from one salvage to the other.
Now we're ready to prepare and cut the fabric. Now this is when the quilt starts to feel real, but it's also where I want you to slow down a little. Cutting is one of those steps where a few extra minutes of care can save you a lot of frustration later. We're going to press the fabric first, cut carefully, and keep everything organized as we go.
Now we'll work more with the fabric panel a little later in the video. For now we're going to work with fabric B, which is the one we use for the borders and the binding. Now before cutting, we're going to press the fabric so it lies flat. Remember, in quilting we press rather than iron. So I'm setting the iron down, lifting it up, setting it down again, instead of sliding back and forth. As we said before, sliding can stretch the fabric, especially when you have long strips or biased edges, and stretched fabrics make pieces harder to sew accurately. So you don't have to make the fabric look like it's reporting for military inspection. You just want it smooth enough that wrinkles won't affect your measurements. Now we'll square up one edge just like we practiced. As I showed you before, you can just line the fold of the fabric with one of the horizontal lines on your mat, and then find a 1-inch marker that you can use, place it just a little bit over that 1-inch marker, and then use your ruler cutting along that perpendicular line to give yourself a nice square edge. Now I'm going to cut the strips listing the pattern for the inner borders, the outer borders, and the binding. I'm going to follow the pattern measurements exactly here. So the first strip I need to create is 2 2¼ by 21-inch strips. Now the full width of my fabric is 42 inches, and so half of that, which is what I have folded, I have 21 inches. So I'm just going to cut the one strip, and that will make the 2 21-inch pieces that I need. There we go, and that's done. Now the next one I need to do are 2 2¼ by 24.5-inch strips. Now 24.5 is more than half of my fabric, so I'm going to have to cut those 2 full strips, and each one will make up that 24.5-inch piece that I need. Now the next one I need are 2 3.5 by 30.5-inch strips. So we'll find 3.5 inches on the ruler, line it up with the edge of the fabric, and make our cut. And it says we need 2 of those. And that's for our outer border sides, and now we need to do the outer border top and bottom, which are also 3.5-inch strips. So 2 of those. And the last one we'll need for our binding are 4 2.5-inch by width of fabric strips. So for those, we'll need the entire length. And we have a little bit left over. Keep that around in case you need it. But typically you don't have a lot left over in quilting kits, so you want to make sure that you're cutting correctly. So measure twice, cut once. Now we've cut our fabric strips to the right width, and we need to go through and cut them to the right length. But before we do, I'm going to go ahead and label all of my pieces so I remember what each one of these was. Unfortunately, it can happen if you get them all mixed up that you wind up turning a border into binding by accident. So take the time while you're cutting to make sure that you're labeling as you go through the process. Now we're going to go ahead and cut each of our fabric pieces to the correct length. Starting with the first one, we said we had 2 1/4 by 21 inch that we need to make. Now remember, it should be at least 21 inches on each side, and so we're just going to cut the salvages off. We'll go ahead and measure using our mat to see if we have the full 21 inches. We do, so we can just cut at the 21 inches, and then we have our 2 pieces. Same rule as before. Line it up with the horizontal line on your mat, then use the inch marker to determine where you need to cut, line up your ruler, and cut. Now we're going to put our label back on that one, put it aside, and we're going to do the same with the rest of our strips. Now this is another time when you want to measure twice, cut once, because you don't want to mess up one of these cuts, or you may find out you don't have enough fabric. Of course, if you purchased your kit from the Quilter's Retreat, just contact me and we'll help get you squared away. It happens when you're a beginning quilter. So remember to consult your pattern, cut each one to length, and then you're ready to move on to the next fabric. Now don't cut the strips that you made for the binding to length. We need those the full length for this step when we do the binding. So you can just continue to leave those aside as they are. Now when we cut fabric C, we'll cut the strips for the inner border just like we did with fabric B. But when we cut our strips for the blocks, we'll then cut the blocks immediately out of that. So again, square up your fabric first, then cut the strips according to the pattern. You want to cut 1 2-inch by width of fabric strip, and then you're going to subcut that into 2 21-inch strips just like we did with fabric B. Then you're going to want to go ahead and cut your 3.5-inch strip. So we're going to line our 3.5-inch strip with the mark on the ruler with the clean edge of the fabric. Hold the ruler steady, keep your fingers away from the edge, and make one smooth cut. Now don't forget to cut your 2-inch block to the 21-inch strips, but now I want to show you how to cut the blocks from your 3.5-inch strip. 3.5 by 3.5-inch blocks. So first you're going to remove your salvages, and since we have our fabric folded, we're going to be cutting 2 squares at a time. So measure 3.5 inches and cut. Measure 3.5 inches again and cut another square. And keep going until you have the number of squares listed in your pattern, which is 9 blocks. We'll actually make 10 because we're cutting 2 at a time, but you can discard 1. Or keep it for another project. Now these squares become the pieced block border around the quilt. Now keep doing this for all of your fabrics. Press, square up the fabric, cut your strips, then cut to length. Remember to keep them organized and label them when you're done.
Step into the Quilter's Retreat where we play with fabrics and laughter. It's a quilter's getaway, from funny t-shirts to...
This method of cutting strips and then subcutting them into smaller units is one of the reasons modern quilting patterns can be so approachable. Instead of tracing and cutting every little shape one at a time, we use strips to make the process more efficient and consistent. Now as you cut, keep your pieces organized. Before moving to your sewing machine, pause and check your pieces against the pattern. Make sure you have the right number of strips and squares.
This is also a good time to take a breath. Cutting can feel like a big step for a new quilter because once the fabric is cut, it feels official. But remember, we're doing this one step at a time, and every quilter learns by cutting, sewing, adjusting, and trying again. Now that our pieces are organized, we need to talk about one of the most important quilting skills before we sew them together, the scant 1/4 inch seam.
Now, as we talk about quilting accuracy, we're going to talk about a 1/4 inch seam. You'll find the 1/4 inch seam marked on the base plate of your sewing machine. You'll also hear quilters talk about a scant 1/4 inch seam. A scant 1/4 inch is just a thread or two narrower than a full 1/4 inch. And that sounds small, and it is, but that's because the thread itself takes up space and the fold of the fabric will take up space. So you want that scant 1/4 inch to compensate for that. Now you'll want to test it and make sure it's correct before you start sewing your quilt. I'm going to test it by sewing 2 scraps of fabric together in what I think is a scant 1/4 inch seam. Now we're going to go ahead and sew that seam. Now we don't back stitch when we quilt because all of the seams are buried somewhere anyway. But let's go ahead and sew what we think is a scant 1/4 inch seam. Now oftentimes quilters will then just pull out their ruler and measure and see if that looks like a 1/4 inch seam. But unfortunately that's not a very good test. The best test is to actually sew several pieces together and then make sure that a piece that is sewn on both sides turns out to be the right finished width. So let's go ahead and sew 3 pieces together and then we'll press it and measure it. Now after sewing we press the seam. Now you see when I'm doing this, I'm first going to set the seam by giving it a little burst of steam with the seam folded flat. And then I'm going to open it up, and remember we're going to press, we're not going to iron. So I'm setting the iron down, lifting it up, not sliding it back and forth. Pressing helps the piece to lie flat without stretching it. And you can use your fingers to kind of finger press it down, make it easier for you to put your iron on it. And now we measure the sample. Now the point of this little test is to see whether our seam allowance gives us the finished size we expect. Our block should be a 3-inch block once it is finished because it's 3.5 and we're taking a 1/2 inch for our 2 1/4 inch seams. Now if yours did not come out this perfect, go ahead and make some adjustments to how your machine is positioned. You can do that by using something like blue painter's tape right along that 1/4 inch marker, and then you can run your fabric along that tape. Another way you can do it, if you find that you're really just off by a thread or two, many machines have the ability to move your needle left or right, and that will help you shift your needle in order to get that perfect scant 1/4 inch seam.
Now that we all understand seam allowance, we're ready to begin sewing the quilt center. Now we're ready to sew the first pieces of the quilt top together. We're going to start with the center panel and the side sashing strips.
So we'll start with fabric A, the center panel. Now here at the Quilters Retreat, we print our fabric through spoon flour, so it usually doesn't need any trimming or squaring. But if you're using a different fabric panel, or if you're using a fat 1/4 of a print you just adore as the center section of your quilt, then you may need to lightly square it or trim it up according to the pattern. Now when trimming a panel, don't get aggressive. We just want the panel neat and straight, but we don't want to accidentally trim away part of the design. So check the pattern measurement, line up your ruler carefully, and trim only what you need. Now we're going to start by pressing our fabric, again, just like we did before. Lift, move the iron, and I'm going to be using some shots of steam here to help get these final wrinkles out. And now we want to take out our ruler or tape measure, and we're going to measure our fabric panel just to make sure that we've got the right size. It should be 18 by 21 inches. This is just about 18, a little bit off, but we can certainly work with that, and 21 inches. So that is exactly what we need to start our quilt. So let's get started. Now to sew the first side strip, place the fabric right sides together. That means the pretty side of the strip faces the pretty side of the panel. Now line up the raw edges. If it doesn't match perfectly, that's fine. We can always ease that in, but we're going to start by placing a pin on one side and then a pin on the other. Line it up perfectly to the ends. And if it doesn't perfectly match, that's okay. You're just going to give it a little tug. Find the center point and put your pin in the center. And then you're going to put a pin on either side of those. Now when I'm putting on borders, I like to pin one side, then pin the other side, then sew them at the same time. That way I don't have to make too many trips back and forth between the sewing machine and the ironing board. Now I'll do the same thing as before. I'll line it up on the two edges, put pins on the edges, and then put pins in the middle. Now this one I'm doing a little bit differently. Now my mom taught me how to put pins in the opposite direction, which I learned is a really neat trick, and I do it almost all the time now. But by putting the pins pointing towards the seam, it actually means I may not have to remove the pin when I sew. I'll tell you more about that when we get to the sewing part, but just notice I put them in a little bit differently this time. Now we're at the sewing machine and we're going to begin sewing our seams using our scant 1/4 inch that we measured before. So keep going. Now this is the side where I have the pins facing in the other direction, and you can see they're far enough away from the presser foot that I can just run down the side here and I don't have to worry about removing my pins. They're not near the presser foot, but they're still holding the fabric securely. Whatever you do, do not sew over a pin. You will not be happy with the outcomes. Bad for the machine, bad for you. Now going on the other side, again, we're going to sew the seam too, but now you'll see me removing the pins. This is okay if this is how you like to do it. Just continue to sew until you reach a pin, take the pin out, and then continue sewing. Now I had a little glitch with my camera, so I don't get to show you how I pressed those sashing down, but I promise to show you in the next step. But for now, I'm going to now move to the inner borders, and we're going to do the same process. I'm going to go ahead and put it matching the raw edges. And pin each edge, and then pin the center, just exactly like we did before. And now we'll do the other side, just as before. Match your raw edges, right side facing. Start pinning on the edges. And again, back to the sewing machine. We're going to sew straight down that seam at our scant 1/4 inch, just like we've done before. Again, if you have your pins where they're going to come in contact with the presser foot, remove your pins before you hit them with the presser foot. You do not want to do that. Okay, now let me show you how to do the pressing. Now first remove your pins if they are still in. Now you're going to set your seam by giving it a little blast of steam. This helps the stitches to relax a bit. Now first, use your hands. Just give it a tiny finger press down just to kind of straighten the back seam out. Then you can go ahead and hit it with some steam to get those seams nice and flat. Again, don't iron. Break it up, put it back down to press. And do the same for the next side. Now in quilting, we don't press our seams open like you might do if you're making garments. Instead, we actually fold them to one side or the other, usually putting the seam behind the dark piece of fabric so that it won't show up like it might for very light fabrics. This helps keep the seam more sturdy and protects the quilt as it is used over time. And now we're going to continue with the top and bottom inner border. So take out the pieces that you labeled for your top and bottom inner border and do the same thing. We'll start with the top, match raw edges, pins at the edges, and then in the side. Again, if you cut your piece a little bit short, I obviously just did that, it's just a tiny bit too short, but that's okay. Go ahead and pin it on the edges and then sort of match it in the middle, find that middle piece. Now, of course, if you're off by a lot, you will want to just recut the piece, but if you're off by a little, you'll be able to ease it in there just fine. Put your pins in the center. And do the same for the bottom piece. I'll speed the video up a bit, but I did want to mention, as you sew, try not to pull the fabric from behind the needle. Just guide it gently, let the feed dogs move it through the machine. Keep the raw edges lined up with your seam guide. Then take it back to the ironing board, remove your pins, set your seam, finger press, and then press your seam. Now this is a great place to notice the rhythm of sewing your quilt top. You're going to pin, sew, press. Pin, sew, press. The project grows one seam at a time. And if you place your ironing board a ways from your sewing machine, you can even get a little exercise in at the same time. Now, borders and sashing do a lot more than make the quilt larger. They give the quilt color, and for large borders, they give the eye a place to rest. In traditional quilts, sashing was often used to separate blocks, frame special fabrics, or bring order to a busy design. And this little quilt, the sashing that we used helped the center panel feel framed and intentional. And you've done it. You've sewn your center panel to your sashing and then to your inner border. Now don't expect perfection, especially on the first quilt. What we're looking for is a quilt center that's flat enough to continue building on. Very nice.
And with that, you've sewn the first major section of the quilt top. This is a big step. We started with separate pieces of fabric, and now we have a framed center ready for our patchwork borders. Now in the next video, we're going to use these 3.5-inch squares to make the pieced block borders. This is where the quilt really starts to get its cheerful patchwork frame. So if this is your first quilt, take a moment to enjoy this stage. You've cut fabric, tested your seam allowance, practiced pressing, and sewn the center of your quilt top. This is not a small thing, this is quilting. So thank you for joining me for video 1, and I'll see you again in video 2.
Quilting every day, quilting every way. At the Quilters Retreat, we brighten your day.